So if you break your arm, an X-ray gives you this really clean, jagged white line.
Right. It's binary.
Exactly. It's either broken or it's not broken. The doctor points to it, you put a cast on it, and the mechanics of the whole problem are just entirely visible.
You can see exactly what's wrong.
Yeah. But for thousands of years, we've been trying to put ancient texts, and specifically the Bible, through this, spiritual X-ray machine.
Oh, absolutely.
We've been looking for these glowing auras of holiness, or, metaphysical jagged lines of sin, or goats in the machine.
Which is incredibly frustrating if you're actually trying to understand the text.
Right. So today, we are unplugging that machine entirely. What if the Bible isn't some spellbook of magic at all? What if instead it is a brutal, primitive, and frankly, brilliantly engineered manual for economic survival?
Because it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters when you try to read a survival manual as if it were, a collection of magical incantations.
Yeah, you miss the point.
You end up missing the actual genius of the text completely.
Exactly. So welcome to the deep dive. And look, if you are listening to this right now and you're expecting a theological or inspirational takeaway, we are initiating a system override.
I really are.
We are conducting a forensic sociological teardown today. We're taking Genesis chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15 and putting them under a microscope.
A very specific microscope.
Right, using an analytical framework from our sources called Materialist Christianity.
And to use this framework properly, there is a core rule, like a universal lens, that you have to adopt for the duration of this analysis.
Okay, later on.
The source material calls this religion as applied physics.
Religion as applied physics.
Right.
Okay, so that implies we are treating ancient human behaviors like laws of motion and gravity.
Precisely. You have to assume from the very outset that the ancient writers were not hallucinating magic.
Right, they weren't just making things up.
No, they were not just sitting around a campfire inventing fairy tales to explain why the sky is blue. They were meticulously, desperately documenting the physical realities of human survival.
And social friction, right?
Yes, social friction and natural law. Every spiritual, miraculous, or divine word in this text is actually a container for a material, sociological, or psychological truth.
So if we're treating this like physics, you're saying a word like holy isn't a description of a glowing divine aura.
Not at all.
It's actually a structural warning label, like, do not touch this specific social boundary, or the entire economic order of the tribe collapses.
That is exactly right. The framework of materialist Christianity asserts that early human morality was not divinely dictated from the clouds.
It was learned the hard way.
Oh, the hardest way. It was materially discovered through agonizing generations of human social evolution and struggle.
So it's basically the record of a species discovering what actually works.
Yes. What works to keep a community from tearing itself apart in a world of just absolute scarcity?
Wow. Okay, before we jump into the text itself, we need to establish one foundational concept from the source material because, well, it governs everything we're about to discuss.
The concept of motion.
Right, the concept of motion. The source makes this really provocative claim. It says, motion is real, not things.
It's a heavy concept.
Help us understand that, because it sounds a bit like an esoteric riddle, to be honest.
Well, it requires a profound shift in how you view reality. We are conditioned to think that static objects define reality. A table is a table.
A rock is a rock.
Right. But in this materialist framework, the object is irrelevant until it does something. Motion defines the reality.
Give us the analogy the source uses, because I think that really helps.
Yeah, the source uses a very grounding analogy. A hammer does not build a house on its own.
Right, it just sits there.
Sitting on a workbench, it is just cold, indifferent matter. It is the act of swinging the hammer, the application of human labor, that produces a change in reality.
And the firewood example, too.
Exactly. Firewood does not produce warmth just by existing. The chemical reaction of burning produces warmth.
So if we apply that logic to Scripture, or to an ancient moral code, the text itself is just the unswung hammer.
Exactly. A law, a scripture, or a moral absolute does not transform behavior until it is spoken, heard, enforced, and enacted.
So morality isn't just floating out there.
No, morality doesn't exist as some glowing platonic orb in the sky. It only becomes real when it is in motion.
Like when it actually dictates how people behave.
Right. How they share scarce water, how they divide land, how they survive a drought.
So when this specific materialist framework looks at the Bible, It isn't looking for static magical objects to worship.
No, it is tracking the historical motion of human behavior adapting to crisis.
I love that framing. It takes the abstract and makes it kinetic. Now, if you were listening to this and thinking, wait, this sounds like we're dragging modern political theory into the Bronze Age.
Which is a fair concern.
It is. So we need to pause and be completely transparent. To decode the mechanics of these texts, the source material heavily utilizes Marxist-Leninist concepts.
Yes, it does.
We are going to be talking about class struggle, capital, primitive accumulation, sub-objects, and modes of production.
It is simply the vocabulary the source uses to map the human friction in the text.
Right. And I want to be crystal clear to you, the listener. Neither of us are taking any political sides here.
Not left, not right.
Exactly. We are strictly and impartially reporting on the mechanics contained in the source material to reveal exactly how this specific framework interprets these ancient texts.
We are just putting on a pair of analytical glasses to see the structural architecture they reveal.
And what they reveal in Genesis 12 is frankly wild.
It is nothing short of a revolution in human organization.
Let's set the stage. Genesis 12 is widely considered the big pivot in the biblical narrative. You have Abram.
Right, just a guy.
Just a guy. And God calls him to leave his home, his country, his father's house, and go to an unknown land. And he is given this massive divine promise.
The famous promise.
The text says God tells him, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and to your offspring I will give this land.
Now, in a traditional reading, that is a moment of pure metaphysical grace.
Yeah, God just picks a guy out of a crowd and does magic.
Right. The traditional reading stops at God said it, so it happened. But our mandate today is to reverse engineer the vocabulary.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If we are looking at this as a magical spell, what is a blessing or a promise in the context of ancient, brutal, nomadic survival?
If we strip away the metaphysics, according to this materialist reading, Genesis 12 documents the founding of class.
The founding of class. Okay, wait. Let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Isn't it incredibly convenient to look at an ancient Bronze Age text about a shepherd and magically find 19th century socioeconomic theory perfectly laid out?
It sounds like a stretch at first.
Yeah. Like, how do we know the source material isn't just projecting modern economic anxieties backward onto a simple tribal myth?
It's a vital question. But the framework argues that it's not projecting backward, it's taking the material conditions of the text at its word.
Okay, how so?
Think about the physical reality of early humanity. The sources describe early human morality, the kind implied in the transition out of hunter-gatherer societies, as primitive, classless, tribal survival.
Right, because in a nomadic tribe of, like, 50 people, morality is just the brutal logic of shared survival.
Exactly. You share the meat, or the tribe dies. There is no alternative.
There's no concept of this is my personal portfolio of berries.
No, none at all. But human history moves. Populations grow. Humanity transitions from nomadic foraging to pastoralism.
Meaning the domestication of animals?
Yes. You get herds and flocks, and suddenly you run head first into a massive structural problem.
Absolute scarcity.
Absolute scarcity. Because humans multiply, and sheep multiply, but the grass and the wells in the ancient Near East do not multiply.
All right, you hit a Malthusian trap.
Precisely. So what is the promise given to Abram, materially speaking? It is the structural codification of property and legacy.
The blessing is a territorial claim.
It is an ancient title deed.
But here's the catch. In Abram's world, there is no centralized state.
No.
There is no police force, no Supreme Court, no county clerk's office to file a deed.
You're on your own.
Right, so if Abram walks into Canaan and says, this pasture is mine, what stops a rival tribe with more swords from just taking it?
Nothing physically. Bloodshed is the natural default of the ancient world when resources run out.
So how do you make a property claim stick without a standing army to enforce it?
You wrap it in untouchable divine authority.
Oh, wow, you have to.
You have to. The blessing is the sociological utility of securing a future. It establishes a lineage.
It basically says this land belongs to this specific biological bloodline forever, by order of the highest possible authority in the cosmos.
Exactly. This isn't just a nice story about a man taking a spiritual journey. It marks the historical transition from communal hand-to-mouth survival to a property-based lineage.
So in Marxist terms, this is the dawn of primitive accumulation.
Yes. The blessing is actually a piece of social technology.
It's an invention designed to keep the human species from tearing itself apart over who gets to feed their sheep where.
It creates order out of chaos, but it does so by inventing exclusive ownership.
Yes. Abram's covenant is a firewall against tribal extinction.
But, and this is key because materialist Christianity is deeply dialectical, that solution immediately generates a new crisis.
Let's define dialectical for the listener in this context, just so we're all on the same page.
Good idea.
It essentially means that human history moves forward through friction. You solve one structural problem, but the very nature of your solution creates the next contradiction.
The next friction point, yes. Motion drives forward through contradiction.
Okay, so let's track the motion into Genesis 13. Abram has the promise of property. He has his flocks.
Lots of flocks.
And his nephew, Lot, is traveling with him. And Lot also has massive flocks. And the text gives us a really profound piece of economic data here.
It says the land could not support both of them dwelling together because their possessions were so great.
Right. And strife breaks out between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen.
Now, on the surface, if you're just reading this in Sunday school, it's a family drama.
Just two guys realizing their employees don't get along, so they need their own space.
Right. But through our materialist lens, what is this friction actually representing?
This is a classic textbook example of a structural crisis driven by scarcity.
Pastoral survival required cunning adaptation. When the productive forces, meaning the thousands of sheep and cattle, outgrow the material base, the finite square footage of grazing land, you have an economic contradiction.
The system is overheating.
Exactly. And as we said, bloodshed is the default historical resolution here. The stronger herdsmen kill the weaker herdsmen, and the winner takes the grass.
But that doesn't happen. Abram and Lot don't go to war.
No, they don't.
Abram steps in and says, "Let there be no strife between you and me, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left."
And that peaceful division is monumental in the history of human consciousness.
It really is.
But to understand exactly how monumental, we need to introduce a core concept from the sources that explains the mechanics of this division.
Okay, what is it?
The sub-object.
The sub-objects. This is a fascinating term. We touched on this idea a little bit earlier with the concept of motion, but let's really drill down. What is a sub-object?
A sub-object is an invisible rule, structure, or agreement that shapes physical reality without having any physical mass itself.
So it is a shared fiction that alters human behavior.
Exactly.
Can you give a modern example of how a sub-object enforces itself?
The sources use two brilliant examples: a stop sign and a paycheck.
Okay, let's start with the stop sign.
Think about a stop sign at an intersection. The physical object is just a piece of red metal on a wooden pole.
Right, it has no kinetic ability to stop a 2-ton vehicle moving at 50 miles an hour.
It cannot physically exert force, yet cars stop.
Because the stop sign represents a sub-object.
Yes, a vast, invisible architecture of social agreement, legal consequence, and mutual survival.
And a paycheck. A piece of paper with numbers on it doesn't contain calories. It can't physically shout at you from the rain.
But the sub-object of the paycheck, the invisible agreement of currency and stored labor, compels millions of people to wake up, sit in traffic, and perform highly specific tasks for 40 hours a week.
It alters human labor and redirects biological energy on a massive scale.
Exactly. So bringing this back to the dust of Canaan in Genesis 13.
Right. When Abram and Lot draw an imaginary line in the sand and say, "You take the left, I'll take the right."
They are literally inventing a moral sub-object to manage an economic contradiction without resorting to murder.
They're establishing borders, property rights, and diplomatic negotiation over brute force.
Yes. They're creating an invisible architecture to govern the scarce grass.
Because the blessing of property required the sub-object of peaceful division to actually function.
Without that shared invisible rule, Abram's promise would just end in a tribal bloodbath.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. Let me push back on this, because this is where the framework seems to trap itself.
Okay, let's hear it.
You just said that the blessing is the accumulation of property, the founding of class, and the securing of an exclusive bloodline.
I did.
Doesn't that inherently create the very oppression, the very hierarchy and inequality that later parts of the Bible, like the prophets or Jesus, absolutely rail against?
Yes.
It feels like we are saying God invented capitalism just so Jesus could dismantle it later.
It absolutely creates that oppression. You have accurately identified the dialectical tension.
Okay.
But remember the universal lens. We aren't looking at God as a static, metaphysical dictator who writes a perfect plan from day one.
Right. We are looking at the historical motion of human consciousness discovering survival mechanics.
So historical necessity is inventing the solution for that specific moment in time.
In the Bronze Age.
Yes, nomadic pastoral survival required property, lineage, and defense. Without primitive accumulation, the tribe starves.
Without the blessing of exclusive land, they die in the desert.
So the creation of property and class was a necessary dialectical step forward from chaotic, endless tribal warfare.
But, and this is the absolute crux of historical materialism, the solution to one historical problem inevitably creates the next contradiction.
Always.
It's like building a dam to stop a catastrophic flood.
Well, that's a good analogy.
The dam saves the town in the short term. It is a necessary piece of technology. But over the next 100 years, the dam creates a massive reservoir that displaces an entire valley ecosystem.
Right.
And now, your descendants have to figure out how to manage this giant, unnatural body of water before it crushes the dam and kills everyone anyway.
That is a perfect analogy for the biblical narrative under this framework. Abram builds the dam of property and lineage to survive the flood of tribal scarcity.
But that dam creates the reservoir of class division.
Master and servant, rich and poor. The rest of the biblical narrative is tracking the human species, trying to survive the pressure of that exact reservoir.
So Abram and Lot separate. The dam is built. Abram is sitting in the land of Canaan, holding this massive promise of property and legacy.
But he has a glaring vulnerability.
He has no heir. Which brings us to the friction of Genesis 14 and 15. In Genesis 14, we see a massive war of kings. 4 kings against 5 kings.
A huge regional conflict.
They sweep through the valley, they capture Lot, and they take all his accumulated wealth.
And Abram actually has to raise a private militia of 318 trained men from his own household to go rescue Lot.
He has to violently protect their assets.
Which perfectly illustrates the material reality of the dam he built. Property requires defense.
You can't just claim it and leave it.
The material reality of holding exclusive land in a tribal world is warfare. You cannot have primitive accumulation without the sword.
Because the economy is based on hoarding and defending.
Right. And then immediately after that visceral, physical conflict over stolen assets, we get the profound psychological shift of Genesis 15.
God comes to Abram in a vision. And Abram is terrified not of kings, but of his own mortality.
He complains that he has no child.
He says a servant in his household will inherit all this wealth he just fought a war to protect.
And God takes him outside into the night and says, "Look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your offspring be."
And then we get one of the most famous sentences in all of Western literature. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness.
This specific verse is perhaps one of the most heavily mystified, spiritually loaded passages in all of Scripture.
Yeah, traditional theology reads faith here as a blind supernatural belief. Abram just mentally assented to a magical proposition, and so God stamped his passport for heaven.
But our materialist Christian lens completely rejects that purely psychological, invisible reading.
Because if motion is real, not things, then faith cannot just be a static thought in Abram's head.
Exactly.
So how do we reverse engineer covenant and faith in this moment?
According to the source material, faith in this context is not intellectual assent to a metaphysical claim. Faith is the binding of generations into continuity.
The binding of generations into continuity. Let's break that down. Why is Abram staring at the stars so crucial?
Because Abram is realizing the terrifying fragility of his own sub-objects. He has accumulated all this capital, his flocks, his land, his survival architecture, his private militia.
But it will all evaporate the second his heart stops beating if he has no structural lineage to hand it to.
Exactly. The covenant, therefore, is not a ticket to a spiritual afterlife. It is a highly engineered mechanism for passing down what the sources call moral capital.
Moral capital, meaning stored labor, stored survival knowledge, stored trust.
Yes. The sources use a very specific, deeply fascinating analogy here to explain what Abram is doing.
Okay.
They compare the establishment of this covenant to the Soviet Union's massive insistence on literacy campaigns in the early 20th century.
Okay, stop right there.
I know, it sounds crazy.
The Soviet insistence on literacy. How on earth does a 20th century industrial literacy campaign connect to a Bronze Age shepherd looking at the stars? You have to connect those wires for me.
All right, think about the material goal of a state-sponsored forced literacy campaign in an agrarian society that is trying to rapidly industrialize.
Okay.
Why does the state care if a peasant can read? It isn't just so they can enjoy poetry in their free time.
No, it's a matter of intergenerational survival.
Yes. If the state is going to build factories, power grids, and a modern military, the knowledge of how to operate those sub-objects cannot die with the engineers who built them.
Right. If the next generation can't read the blueprints, the power grid collapses.
Exactly. Literacy is the vehicle for the inheritance of complex structural knowledge. It ensures the group survives and progresses beyond a single lifespan.
When you teach a child to read, or when a family teaches a specialized trade to their children, you are passing down accumulated human labor and wisdom so the next generation doesn't have to start from zero.
You are binding the generations together.
Oh, wow. So for Abram, the literacy he needs to pass down isn't reading and writing. It's the architecture of his property claim.
Yes.
It's the covenant.
Us. Abram, looking at the stars, is the realization of what Marxists call species being.
Species being.
It is the profound, world-altering realization that his survival isn't just about his own heartbeat, his own immediate caloric intake.
It is about building a structure that outlasts his physical body.
He realizes he is part of a continuous species. The covenant is the material inheritance of order.
So when the text says he believed, he isn't just saying, I think this magic is true. He is actually committing his physical labor to the structure. He is committing to the sub-object of the covenant, trusting that this massive intergenerational project will succeed, even if he doesn't live long enough to see the end of it.
Exactly. Faith is the subjective commitment to a material historical process. To use another analogy, it's the stonemason laying the foundation for a cathedral, knowing full well he will be dead 100 years before the roof goes on.
He trusts the structure.
He trusts the motion.
But this raises a really heavy tension in the narrative. Genesis 15 ends with this terrifying, visceral vision. A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between cut-up animal carcasses.
It's an ancient, bloody way of signing a binding contract.
So Abram has the structure of the promise. He has the legal sub-object. He has the covenant. But the material reality, the actual biological child, the actual settled nation, the actual safe grazing land, hasn't happened yet.
He is standing in the dark, staring at the stars, holding a contract for a future he cannot physically see.
And our mandate from the sources is that we must leave Abram right there.
Yes. We are strictly forbidden from looking ahead to the birth of Isaac to resolve this tension. We cannot peek at the next chapter.
Why? Why is that rule so crucial to this materialist framework? Because as a reader, I desperately want the payoff.
Because if we resolve it now with a neat narrative bow, we miss the entire weight of the dialectic. We miss the agonizing reality of human struggle.
Right.
Abram is carrying the weight of an unresolved contradiction. He has invented the social technology, the covenant of property and lineage, but he has to live in the massive gap between the invention of the structure and its materialization.
And that tension, the waiting, the physical labor, the doubt, the uncertainty, is where human morality is actually forged.
It is not forged in the magical resolution. It is forged in the struggle to maintain the sub-object.
So we anchor Abram right here in the dust. He is holding a covenant that secures human survival through exclusive biological lineage and accumulated private property.
Yes, that is the exact wire we have successfully run from Genesis 12 to Genesis 15.
We have reverse engineered the vocabulary.
The mechanism we have isolated is this: tribal survival achieved through the codification of private property, class distinction, and exclusive bloodline inheritance.
Okay, take a breath, because we are about to transition to the final and honestly the most mind-bending step of this entire deep dive.
Here we go.
The sources call this the trace protocol. Our instructions are clear and unyielding. We have to map this exact material mechanism from Genesis, this specific covenant of hoarded property and class lineage, directly to the New Testament.
Directly.
We have to see how it is resolved or utilized or hacked by Christ.
And we must do this without resorting to generic theological summaries about love or salvation.
No, we have to do the dialectical math. We have to show the continuous line from the specific friction we just isolated in the Bronze Age to the specific resolution in the first century.
To do that, we need to introduce exactly how materialist Christianity views the figure of Christ. Because again, if we are adhering to religion as applied physics, there are no ghosts in the machine.
Right. In this framework, Christ is not presented as a metaphysical deity floating down from the clouds to sprinkle magic forgiveness dust on humanity.
No. The sources describe him with a very specific, almost technical term, the reference implementation.
Reference implementation. That sounds like a software engineering term.
It does.
Like the master code that proves a new operating system actually works.
That is exactly how it functions here. He is the non-contradictory human who completes the moral circuit.
Okay.
Remember our core rule. History moves through contradictions. Abram's invention of property solved nomadic starvation, but it created class oppression.
And the later invention of the law solved social chaos, but it created religious hypocrisy and elite hoarding.
Yes. By the time you get to the Roman Empire in the 1st century, the mechanism of survival via exclusive property and strict biological bloodline has become an absolute nightmare of inequality, debt, and imperial extraction.
To use our earlier analogy,
Mm-hmm.
the dam that Abram built has flooded the entire valley and the people are drowning in the reservoir.
Yes. The system is collapsing under the weight of its own historical contradictions. The sub-objects of property and bloodline have become weapons of mass oppression.
So Christ enters the historical stage to confront this exact mechanism.
He does not come to magically erase the physical world. He comes to absorb the old covenant and re-engineer the sub-objects.
Okay, let's trace the wires. We have 3 specific anchors from the source material to prove this dialectical math.
Let's look at anchor number 1.
The confrontation with accumulated property.
Right. In Genesis 12 and 13, survival meant primitive accumulation. It meant hoarding flocks, defending land with the militia, and trusting the blessing of wealth.
And in the New Testament, we see the direct confrontation of that exact mechanism. In Luke chapter 18, verse 22, a rich young ruler comes to Jesus.
Now look at this man through our materialist lens. He perfectly represents the absolute success of Abram's original mechanism.
He really does. He has the accumulated property, he has the correct biological lineage, and he has kept the structural law.
He is the winner of the Bronze Age survival algorithm.
So what does the reference implementation say to him? Jesus looks at him and says, "Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me."
This is a direct structural subversion of the Genesis 12 to 15 reliance on accumulated property for survival.
It's a complete 180.
Jesus is identifying that the old survival mechanism has become an engine of oppression. The blessing has become a curse.
He is demanding the liquidation of the very class structure that Abram's covenant founded.
He is telling the rich ruler that his hoarded capital is no longer the vehicle for species being, it is the obstacle to it.
Wow. He's basically saying, the dam worked for your ancestors, but now you have to blow it up so the water can flow to everyone.
Exactly.
But what does this mean for the lineage aspect? Because Genesis 15 wasn't just about property. It was entirely obsessed with biological descendants. The covenant was literally in the blood.
Which brings us to anchor number 2.
Yes, the biological lineage. This was the most exclusive sub-object of all. If you weren't born into the right bloodline, you were outside the covenant of survival.
In John chapter 15, Jesus introduces a massive re-engineering of this exact concept.
He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches, abide in me."
On a spiritual level, people read that as a nice metaphor about staying close to Jesus.
But materially,
Materially, he is taking the imagery of a bloodline, a family tree, and replacing it with a community of shared action.
the covenant of biological lineage is hacked into a covenant of shared labor and continuity.
Yes, you are no longer in the covenant because of the DNA of your father. You are in the covenant because you actively participate in the labor of love, justice, and mutual survival.
He takes a closed, exclusive system, Abram's physical DNA, and makes it an open-source moral framework.
Anyone can plug into the vine if they adopt the behavior.
It's a brilliant sociological maneuver. He strips the covenant of its exclusionary tribal requirements while maintaining the immense structural strength of intergenerational continuity.
He keeps the literacy of the covenant, but he makes the school public.
Which brings us to the final anchor, the ultimate proof of the dialectical math. Anchor number 3.
Communion in the early church.
In Genesis 14, we saw Abram forced to raise a private militia and go to war to protect his private assets from rival kings. The economy was based on hoarding, defending, and the threat of mutually assured destruction.
But look at the dialectical fulfillment of this in the book of Acts, chapters 2 and 4.
The early Christ followers, immediately after internalizing this new open-source framework, do something economically radical.
The text says they had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need.
Communion is the real economy. They aren't just performing a symbolic ritual with a tiny piece of bread and a sip of wine on a Sunday morning.
Precisely. They are literally enacting a new mode of production. Christ has universalized the covenant.
The inheritance is no longer a physical piece of grazing land in Canaan that you have to kill people to keep. The inheritance is shared moral capital.
So the survival of the few Abram-specific, biologically isolated tribe is what Marxists would call sublated.
Let's define sublation. It means the original concept isn't completely destroyed, but it is elevated, transformed, and integrated into a higher truth.
The survival of the few is sublated into the survival of the many.
It becomes a universalized moral system where nobody starves because the invisible sub-object governing the community is no longer hoard and defend. It is sell and share.
You've got it. That is the completed circuit. The historical contradiction of class, scarcity, and warfare, which was birthed out of sheer necessity in Genesis 12, finds its dialectical resolution in the communal, fiercely shared living of Acts 2.
The mechanism of the covenant wasn't destroyed by Christ. It was fulfilled. It was expanded, stripped of its exclusivity, and stretched until it could hold all of humanity.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a deep breath, because we have covered a staggering amount of ground, and we have fundamentally rewired how to look at these texts.
We really have.
Let's recap the algorithmic progression of this journey. We started by looking at a broken X-ray machine. We agreed to unplug the search for magical ghosts and instead plug into the gravity of historical material friction.
We watched an ancient text use the language of the divine to solve a brutal physical problem, the problem of tribal survival in a world of absolute scarcity.
It solved it through the invention of property, class, and biological lineage with Abram.
But we didn't stop there. We saw how that solution operated dialectically.
It created new friction, the tension of scarcity, the necessity of war, and the heavy, agonizing weight of passing down moral capital into an unknown future while staring at the stars.
And then we traced that exact specific wire forward. We saw how that ancient survival mechanism was historically evolved, confronted, and ultimately hacked by the reference implementation of Christ.
He took the covenant of hoarded property and exclusive bloodlines and re-engineered it. He liquidated the class structure and open-sourced the lineage, creating a universal system of shared moral capital that no longer required extracting surplus from others to survive.
It is an incredible trajectory to trace.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to turn this analytical lens directly onto you, the listener. We've spent this time dissecting the invisible architecture of the Bronze Age in the 1st century. But how do these invisible sub-objects operate in your own life today?
What structures, what paychecks, what modern stop signs, what unspoken social contracts are governing your behavior, your labor, and your relationships without you even realizing it?
Are you operating under a system of primitive accumulation? Hoarding resources out of a fear of scarcity?
And I will leave you with a final, lingering concept drawn directly from the core of our materialist sources. In this specific framework, the idea of eternal life is not a ghost floating in the clouds playing a harp after your body dies.
What is it then?
Eternal life is your enduring material contributions to collective social growth beyond your individual lifespan. It is the moral capital you leave behind in the people, the structures, and the systems you touch.
It is the trade you teach the next generation. It is the structural literacy you pass down. It is the dam you build or the dam you choose to dismantle.
Are the sub-objects you are participating in today passing down a covenant of hoarded property and exclusion? Or are you passing down a covenant of shared moral capital?
It all comes back to the motion you create in the world.
Because motion is real, not things.
We started this deep dive talking about a broken X-ray machine, looking for a clean, jagged white line of metaphysical certainty. But what we found instead wasn't an X-ray of a static dead bone.
No.
We found a living, beating heart of human struggle, captured in ancient texts, continually evolving, continually pushing through contradictions toward a world where everyone can finally rest. Keep questioning the invisible architecture of your world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.